My life growing up was pretty unstable. I wanted so bad to have that nuclear family that I had lacked.
Brian Cargill is an architect in search of a wife and the white picket fence.
Kimberly was really beautiful and charismatic. I felt like, oh, she really gets me.
But when Kimberly turns into a human wrecking ball,
It's just out of nowhere. She just punched me in the face.
It's bad and evil. He was sleeping with the devil.
no one in Brian's life will be safe.
I took photographs of the abuse. We went into hiding immediately.
This body was so badly burned, they couldn't identify who it was.
She is one of the most vindictive, violent female psychopaths ever.
I was born in Wichita Falls, Texas. It was a great way to grow up, for sure. The adults are like, kids go outside, and so we just played in the barn where there's like big tractors and stuff. It was really fun. And my parents were married for about 3 years, and they got divorced. So my mom was pretty much a single mom, and she moved us around a lot.
As a boy, Brian Cargill's life is in constant motion.
I ended up going to probably 6 different elementary schools, probably 5 or 6 different junior highs, and 3 different high schools. It was pretty unstable most of the time.
Brian vows to build a secure future for himself. And when he graduates high school, he sets his sights on architecture.
I've always been very interested in buildings and structures and things like that. It just came so naturally to me. So by the time I got to graduation time, I already knew that I was going to go to architecture school.
By 1993, Brian is a 28-year-old architect living in Dallas. He's happily married, or so he thinks.
After a couple of years, my wife decided that she didn't want to be married anymore. And so I was just kind of left reeling. It was a big shock for me. At that point, my dreams had pretty much crumbled, and I was in an extremely vulnerable state. I just didn't know what to do with myself. I was just so distraught over this loss of kind of this idea of the nuclear family. That just seemed like all I could think about.
9 months after the divorce is finalized, one of Brian's friends sets him up on a blind date.
He described her as very beautiful and very vivacious and intelligent, and he thought that we would be a good match.
Kimberly West is a 27-year-old receptionist.
We met, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. She was really beautiful and just a very charismatic personality. She had just gotten divorced. She was in a custody situation with her ex. And so we kind of had some things in common. You know, we really hit it off.
Over the next several weeks, Brian and Kimberly start talking on the phone every day.
I felt like, oh, she really gets me. That she heard me, that she identified with me in a way that certainly my ex-wife had not done at all. It felt very romantic and just exciting. So it was great. Our second date was at a divorce support group at a church. And I got there a little early, and she was running late. Instead of waiting outside, I decided to just go ahead and go in. And so I sat down, and I kind of saved her a chair next to me. She finally came in, and she looked straight at me and kind of gave me a mean look. She sat in a different chair across the group from me. And so I was very kind of mystified as to, what was going on. After that, she really was mad at me because I had gone in ahead of her. She said, "This is my support group. You're my guest." She's really kind of disproportionately angry about that. Then, just out of nowhere, she just held me back. It was kind of getting a little passionate. And then she just said, "I have to leave now." The whole thing left me feeling, this is a little weird. That whole second date was just strange.
As unnerving as the experience is, the next time Kimberly and Brian see each other, she acts as if nothing happened.
It started getting much more passionate. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and it was very powerful, and it was one that I'd not really experienced to that degree up until that point in my life. Kimberly was able to stir these feelings, in me, the passionate feelings, both physically and emotionally. I feel like I started falling in love with her pretty quickly, just because I did feel like this immediate, really strong connection.
Kimberly seems to be feeling the same way, because she treats Brian like he is a close, trusted companion.
Kimberly has a court date with her ex-husband, and he's going for full custody.
She wanted me to testify in court for her as a character witness. And at this point, I had known her for maybe 2 months. So I went to the courthouse with her, and when she was in the hearing, one of her friends gave me a copy of her psychological report. I read through the report, but so much of it, I didn't know what to make of it. Like, it had a lot of psychological terms that I wasn't familiar with, such as narcissism and borderline personality disorder.
Now, borderline personality disorder, that's the mother of all disorders. That's everything combined into one.
And individuals with borderline personality disorder have affective instability. They have emotions that are unstable. This is somebody who is highly impulsive, dramatic, has an intense fear of abandonment, and furthermore expresses typically some type of violence. It can be verbal aggression, physical aggression.
I was very conflicted about the whole report and wasn't sure what to make of it. She told me that her husband paid off psychologists to make fabricated psychological reports. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is a professional psychologist, and they don't just fabricate reports. And so I thought there was something there that I needed to be careful about.
The judge rules against Kimberly, and she is devastated. Brian feels for her and doesn't question her about the report.
I didn't want to have another failed relationship. In my previous marriage, I didn't get to fight for that relationship at all. So I didn't want to just walk away from the relationship, but kind of fight for it and do the best I possibly could to make it work.
The couple continue to see each other but live separately. Brian walks on eggshells to avoid Kimberly's bad temper.
If I said anything at all positive about my ex-wife, she would often jump all over that and say something pretty mean and nasty about her. Kimberly would often try to undermine my relationship with my ex-wife because she felt like it was threatening her relationship with me. Kimberly always could escalate, just acted very aggressively.
Really, what you have here is a powder keg. She's always exploding in this fit of rage if she doesn't get her way. She screams, she yells, it's my way or no way.
That was making me very unhappy. I started feeling that, okay, I don't think I need to be in this relationship. This relationship is starting to be something that's negative for me.
5 months into the relationship, Brian is ready to make a clean break.
We just had one fight too many, and I had finally solidified my resolve that I was going to break up. So I knew I was going to have this conversation with her. I'd kind of prepared for it mentally. So I don't care what she says, I'm done with this. I was actually feeling pretty good about it. I was feeling a little bit of a sense of relief that I had kind of dodged a bullet. Okay, I'm going to put this behind me, just move on. I was about to say, all right, I'm done with this. I'm not seeing you anymore. Don't call me, etc. And that's when she told me she was pregnant.
I'm pregnant.
I felt like I was at the beginning of a horrible, horrible journey.
Just as Brian Cargill is about to break up with his girlfriend Kimberly, she tells him she is pregnant.
In that moment, my entire body just dropped, and it felt like kind of falling over a cliff. It's this flush of dread that just completely fills you and overwhelms you. But my first thought was, okay, we're gonna make this work. We're gonna take this curveball and we're gonna hit it out of the park. I mean, I'm not gonna walk away from a woman that is carrying my child. I'm just not gonna do that. And so I did propose to her the idea that, I will stick by you during the pregnancy. I want to be a part of the child's life no matter what, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be married to do that. And she put it to me very plainly.
You'll never see me again.
If you don't marry me, you're not having anything to do with this child. Period.
It is the ultimate blackmail. Guess what? I'm pregnant. And now you're stuck. Anything is possible with this woman. She'll do anything.
I felt like I'd put myself in a situation where I didn't really have a lot of a choice. The value of being a parent had to trump really everything else. A couple days later, we went out and had a nice little engagement dinner. In that moment, I tried to get as much out of it as I could, get as much joy and celebration as I could, and kind of leave the other stuff behind. And even though it wasn't going to be as pure as I wanted originally, still could be something.
The fact that he stays with her after all of this is a huge testament to his character. But it also tells her, I can do anything I want to this guy. And you know what? He's going to stick around. Why? Because he has a conscience. She doesn't.
In June of 1994, Brian and Kimberly have a small, intimate wedding in New Mexico.
We had a little wedding at my mom's house, and I tried to maintain an air of kind of celebration and that I was happy about it and everything, but deep inside, I was really scared and just dreading kind of what was to come. To the point where right after the ceremony, I kind of went in the back of the house and just kind of had a good cry and just kind of let out so many of these emotions that I was having there.
The couple move in together, and a few months later in November, Kimberly gives birth to their son, Jamie.
After Jamie was born, I was jubilant. And so it was kind of a nice period of time. It was pretty calm, relatively peaceful. I felt a sense of relief that maybe this was gonna start to be okay. Maybe we can make this work. But then things really kind of went downhill. I remember one time I had gone into the bedroom and locked the bedroom door because I was trying to kind of get away from her. So she started like kicking the door. And so I was like, okay, this is not good. So I opened the door and I walked out. And then this hammer comes just whizzes by my head and sticks into the wall. And I turned around and I looked at her. And she had kind of this wild look in her eyes.
The hammer lodges itself in the wall, and what does she do? She leaves it there. She tells him, don't you touch that hammer. Why? She wants to remind him, if you don't do what I say, there's gonna be a price.
And I just remember just this horrible feeling just washed over me about, man, what am I doing? How am I ever gonna like get through this? It was just definitely just the low point in my life.
Kimberly's violent streak is only just beginning.
We were sitting in a car and she got angry with me because of a conversation we were having, and she with her fist just punched me as hard as she could in the face. It was just such a shock that I just said, I'm done. That punch in the face was really just the final straw. I just got out of the car and I left and never went back.
Brian immediately files for divorce from Kimberly. Over the following months, the battle for custody of his son becomes emotional warfare, with Kimberly pulling out all the stops to make Brian's life miserable.
Brian, this is Kimberly. I'm sick of being hung up on. The only reason why I tried you at 7:45 at work is because I had been trying your other number since last night.
So at this point, she was not working at all. And she would call me all the time. At some point, I started creating a phone log all the times that she called me. I counted one day, like literally 50 times she called me at work.
I'm just disgusted with your treatment of me. I'm disgusted with your ulterior motives.
She would call, and I would say, I'm busy, and then she would start threatening the receptionist. It was just insanity. Eventually, I decided to leave my first job just because she had called me at work so many times. But I was giving her basically all my money. I was still paying her rent and like giving her probably 75% of my paycheck every month. That was a tough time.
Brian can't afford a lawyer and sees Jamie at Kimberly's whim during the divorce process. When the dust settles in 1995, he gets shared custody of Jamie, but Kimberly continues to make life difficult.
She would kind of do a bait and switch in terms of visitation with my son.
I'm not keeping him from you, but I'm not going to allow him to go off overnight until several matters are mediated.
That was the big thing, was I was always at her mercy when I could see him. One time, she got really mad at me and decided I wasn't going to see Jamie anymore, ever. I showed up at her house, and she wouldn't give him to me.
It doesn't make any sense why you would drive all the way out here knowing that I'm not going to turn Jamie over.
Another time, I came anyway, even though she said she wasn't going to let me have him, and then she just let me have him. So she just liked to play games with the visitation.
It's a tough blow for Brian.
I loved my son before he was born. To see him and spend time with him, it's almost like a spiritual, you know what that connection is like.
Really, the only hold that she has over Brian now is the child. But that's a huge piece of leverage. She has a piece of Brian's heart. She knows the guy is a caring individual and that he loves his child. So she is totally using this child to manipulate the guy.
Over the years, Jamie pays a steep price for being Brian's son.
I was concerned. A lot of times he would call me asking me for help. He would tell me things that were alarming. Like, she started screaming at me, and so I ran out the door and ran down the street to someone's phone to call.
Hey, Daddy, it's me.
Those kinds of calls are gut-wrenching. I was really scared for him.
When he's just 11 years old, Jamie makes a chilling confession to Brian.
They had this big physical conflict. She put a belt around his neck.
She wraps a belt and drags the kid around the room. Let me drag him around the room, cut off his oxygen to let him know who the boss is. Could it get any more violent than that?
Jamie was at a point where he thought he was going to be strangled. He thought that his life was going to end. So it was a dramatic escalation in violence.
Sorry. I saw outright abuse that leaves bruises, marks. I was horrified. What parent wouldn't be horrified to see their child injured?
When Brian hears about this, that's it. He's got to take that kid out of that house. He has to. When you look at all of this building up, what is she gonna do next? What's left? Murder?
Brian Cargill has just found out that his 11-year-old son has been physically abused by his ex-wife, Kimberly.
I finally had evidence, like hardcore, irrefutable evidence that I could take to a judge and make some progress. I took photographs of the abuse and then immediately went to an attorney.
Brian reports Kimberly to Child Protective Services, providing them with proof of her abuse. And 10 years after the divorce in 2006, he finally gains full custody of Jamie.
It was a positive step for sure. At least now I had some sense of stability with my son.
But shockingly, the courts still allow Kimberly unsupervised visitation.
He would go to her house every other weekend. And there was always that worry for him.
With the system failing his son, Brian remains vigilant and keeps a watchful eye on Kimberly. But soon, he finds a measure of peace after meeting a woman worthy of his love.
We met and kind of hit it off, and after that, that was it. It's like we didn't really date anyone else. From our first date, we were pretty much, okay, this is it. I knew that she would make my life better. She is truly like the most emotionally stable person I know. So for me, that was a big, as you can imagine, that was a big priority.
Kimberly moves on with her life as well. She goes to nursing school and marries another man. They have a son.
Happy first birthday. We love you, Keith, Jill, Madeline, and Hayes.
But it doesn't last. Soon, Kimberly is divorced and engaged in yet another custody battle. This time, it will turn deadly. The trouble begins when she decides to hire a babysitter for her 4-year-old son while she's at work as a licensed nurse.
A friend of hers mentions a woman, Cherry Walker, in an apartment building not far from where she lives. By all accounts, she's just this wonderful, warm, 39-year-old woman.
Cherry was described as a very friendly, agreeable individual who had an interest in babysitting. Cherry had an IQ of 56, so this is profoundly developmentally disabled. So she was operating at a 6th grade level. So someone who could arguably be very easily manipulated.
She's living in an apartment by herself for the first time in her life. She has an aide that visits her at the apartment to make sure she's doing okay. And in walks Kimberly Cargill. The devil walks into Cherry Walker's life. And it's never going to be the same again.
Cherry is unable to say no to Kimberly, who takes advantage of her kindness.
Kimberly would drop the son off at Cherry's apartment and just leave him there for hours, come back super late or the next morning to pick him up. Cherry was on a very fixed income given her disability. She relied on food stamps to buy food for herself. And so she had this little boy at her house who would be dropped off hungry. Kimberly didn't leave any money for food, so Cherry would share hers.
Kimberly found someone she could exploit at will. Hey, can I drop the kid off for 2 hours? She'd come back 8 hours later. Or she'd drop the child off and maybe not show up for 2-3 days.
Thanks a lot for
She knew that Cherry Walker really wasn't going to say anything about this, that she could just continually do this over and over and over again.
The boy's father accuses Kimberly of abusing their son.
Kimberly Cargill's child is being abused, and social services gets involved, and they open an investigation against her.
In March of 2010, Child Protective Services removes Kimberly's son from her home. A custody hearing is ordered, and Cherry Walker is unwittingly caught up in the legal battle.
The court subpoena Cherry Walker to testify in court against Kimberly Cargill.
Cherry receives a subpoena as a frequent caretaker of the little boy. Immediately, Kimberly becomes concerned because if Cherry Walker is taking the stand in court, it'll become quickly evident that Kimberly's really not fit to be caring for a young child.
I think that Kimberly was specifically worried about Cherry's testimony because Cherry was probably going to say something truthful, saying that she was a bad mother and violent.
Cherry's taking care of that child. She had seen the abuse and the neglect that Kimberly Cargill perpetrated against that child. She was really the best witness.
I think that Kimberly believed everything was riding on this particular hearing. This was the last son she had custody of. This was her last hope to prove that she was a competent mother. This was her last chance.
Kimberly's first reaction is to just blow up Cherry Walker's phone. She actually calls her over 70 times, so she's panicking.
Cherry is not the only person who Kimberly is frantically calling. On June 18, 2010, just 5 days before Kimberly's custody hearing is set to begin, she phones her ex, Brian.
I was on the way out of town with my wife going on a long weekend, and Kimberly called me. I saw it was her and I didn't answer. She left a message on my voicemail. It was a bit frantic. Have you been subpoenaed? What are you going to tell them if they subpoena you? It was a little strange, but I just kind of disregarded it. Kimberly was really the last person that I wanted to hear from.
The next day, on June 19th, a driver on a small country road makes a tragic discovery.
This young guy is out delivering pizza. He's driving down the road and he realizes he went past the address, so he has to do a turnaround. He heads into this gravel area where it's an open field, and then he looks and he sees what appears to be a body. So of course, he dials 911, and in come the crime scene guys.
Investigators rush to the scene.
They find a woman face down, and it appears that she had been burned. Her body has been charred. Her skin is actually peeling off. It's been burned so badly. And in between her legs, they find this empty creamer container. It's not burned. They also determine that the victim has not been there long, probably within 24 hours.
Investigators determined that this person likely died of homicidal violence because this body was so badly burned, they couldn't identify who it was.
Detectives can't find an ID anywhere near the body, so they put out a media alert in hopes of getting any information on their Jane Doe. Across town, Guthrie and Rowan Walker, a pastor and his wife, reach out to police. Their beloved daughter has been missing for 24 hours.
This is a daughter who is constantly in touch with them. There's not maybe 4 hours that go by that they don't know where she is. Nobody has seen her. And there's one thing their daughter never does, and that is miss church. But on this day, she never shows up. And this is when they begin to realize something's drastically wrong here. So where is she? A media report goes out of this victim that's found, and they just know in their heart and their soul that it's her. So they go to the police, and sure enough, it's their daughter, Cherry Walker.
Smith County sheriffs have identified a burned female victim as Cherry Walker by using her dental records. Brian Cargill finds out about Cherry's murder when he gets a call from Kimberly's mother.
It kind of blew me away. It was pretty surreal. And I immediately kind of made the connection with Kimberly. Maybe she had something to do with this. Jamie and I went into hiding immediately. It was surreal for sure. I never imagined that I would be in that kind of a situation where I'd be afraid that someone was going to come and attack us. It was a scary thought, that maybe she had gotten into this manic state and was ready to come out and kill everyone she knew.
investigators conduct a search of Cherry Walker's apartment, looking for leads.
They're looking around, and they discover several voicemails. They're from a woman named Kim, who says, "Hey, Cherry, I have to talk to you." And she sounds a bit frantic.
Cell phone records also showed that this number had called Cherry over and over and over and over. There were dozens upon dozens of phone calls to Cherry Walker the day before she went missing.
So investigators immediately need to find out, who is this Kim? They interview Cherry Walker's aide, and they ask her, "Do you know anybody named Kim?" "Oh yeah, I know somebody named Kim. That's Kimberly Cargill." So now they're getting somewhere.
Cherry's caregiver was one of the last people to see her before she went missing, and during the course of questioning her, police learn about the situation with Kimberly Cargill, the babysitting arrangement, the subpoena, and the child custody hearing. She says Kimberly told Cherry not to go to court, to ignore the subpoena, but Cherry wanted to follow the rules. She was really concerned about getting in trouble.
She's scared. Kimberly is blowing up Cherry's phone, calling, and she wants to meet with Cherry to discuss the situation.
In Cherry's last conversation with the caregiver, Cherry says Kimberly is going to come over, she's going to take me out to dinner, and Cherry's caregiver tells her, "Do not go, lock the door, go to bed, do not answer if Kimberly comes to your house, and don't go anywhere with her."
She goes, "Listen, ignore Kim, get some sleep, and tomorrow we'll deal with all of this." But for Cherry Walker, tomorrow never comes. The aide never sees her again.
Investigators head directly to Kimberly's house to speak with her.
She comes to the door, and they say, "Hey, listen, we want to talk to you about Cherry Walker." And she says, "I don't think I should talk to you without my lawyer." That's a red flag. If you're a friend of this woman's, why wouldn't you want to talk to us?
Kimberly maintained her arrogant disposition the whole way. The police wanted to search the house, and Kimberly would not permit them.
So investigators park down the street. They sit in their car, and they wait for Kim Cargill to leave. She leaves. She starts driving. Kimberly is really frantic. She's totally out of her mind. And she blows through a stop sign. So they pull her over. And immediately, what do they notice in her car? One of those creamer containers. And what do they have at their crime scene where Cherry Walker was dumped? They have that same empty container of creamer. So there's a connection. They seize her car, and they tow that car to forensics.
While the forensics team searches Kimberly's car for evidence, police execute a search warrant for her home.
Investigators made note that the house was messy. There were dirty clothes, trash everywhere, pieces of food on the floor, used takeout, fast food containers, trash in the bathtub. It was very unclean and disarray.
And then they go into the laundry room. They see laundry piled up from probably weeks. But in the washing machine, there's one sheet. Kim Cargill was washing one sheet? Question mark. Why? At the crime scene, they found these tire tracks, and those match perfectly to Kimberly Cargill's vehicle. They also find that Kimberly's DNA matches the DNA found on the coffee creamer container found between Cherry Walker's legs. They have now connected Kimberly Cargill to the murder scene and to the body. She is arrested, and they charge her with capital felony murder. She's dead to rights. There's no doubt in their mind that Kimberly Cargill murdered Cherry Walker.
Kimberly Cargill has been arrested and charged in the brutal murder of her son's babysitter, 39-year-old Cherry Walker.
It was a big relief when she was arrested. We all kind of were able to breathe a little better, sleep a little bit better at night. It was really not a doubt in my mind that she was guilty.
In May of 2012, Kimberly's case goes to trial in Smith County. By this time, and much to Brian's relief, Kimberly has had minimal contact with her son, Jamie.
As a prosecutor, I believe she killed Cherry Walker, and I wanted to get justice for Cherry. I believed in the evidence. When you have an item with the DNA sample, that belongs to Kim Cargill, and Kim Cargill knows Cherry Walker, and Cherry Walker was going to be picked up by her that night. You know, it's not hard to put two and two together on this. You just dumped a body, killed someone and dumped a body, and set it on fire.
It appears that Kimberly Cargill strangled Cherry Walker inside her house, wrapped her in a sheet, took her out into that field by the road, untangled her from the sheet, poured some sort of accelerant on her, and lit her on fire to cover up forensic evidence.
She killed her. She dumped her body and burned it so she wouldn't get caught. It all supports everything that common sense tells you. That Kim didn't want Cherry to testify. She didn't want her to go to that hearing because she felt like it was going to be a problem. And then all of a sudden, Cherry's dead. So, you know, it all fits.
Kimberly takes the stand in her own defense and pleads not guilty.
Her defense was that she was there when Cherry Walker died, but she did not kill her. She said that she took Cherry out to dinner to talk about the whole situation.
She says she's driving down the road and Cherry Walker had a seizure and that she could not save her or revive her from it. She died.
She said she drove around in a panic, dumped the body into a field, and burned it because she was afraid, even though she said she didn't kill her, she would get blamed for it, so she tried to dispose of the body.
There's a point where Kimberly's behavior kind of borders on delusional. She was supremely confident in her ability to escape responsibility, to manipulate. She thinks that the jury is going to look at this excuse and say, oh, that makes sense. You know, your friend dies, so you set them on fire and dump their body.
Brian Cargill is called as a witness for the prosecution.
When I was in court testifying and on the stand, I did not want to look at her. I was aware of her, but I never really looked her in the eye. I just had no need for that. You know, what she had done was horrible. She took someone else's life, which is hard to even really fathom.
The jury quickly comes back with a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kimberly Cargill, guilty of the offense of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
The verdict came in, I felt relieved that Kim had been held accountable for what she did.
Kimberly Cargill is found guilty on all counts of capital felony murder, and they vote for the death penalty.
It didn't surprise me at all that she would get the death penalty. She took advantage of Cherry to that degree and then turned around and killed her. I mean, that's just outrageous. It really is outrageous.
In the aftermath of the sentencing, those who knew Kimberly are left wondering how she could have committed such a heinous act.
That always stuck out to me, that we have this spectrum of goodness and kindness and a sweet person cross paths with everything that was bad and evil. Kim was someone who had no empathy for others, no feelings of regret or remorse for anything she did.
Kimberly was nothing but a menace who abused Brian and abused her children. I think she is one of the most vindictive, violent female psychopaths ever. Brian Cargill should consider himself lucky, and he should count his blessings because he was sleeping with the devil. Only the devil decided not to kill him, but to kill somebody else.
Even though she met a tragic end, Cherry's light will never be forgotten.
When the trial concluded, there was a photo and evidence of Cherry. She was smiling. She was happy. I printed that photo. I put it in a frame. I wanted that photo in my office to remember as a prosecutor why you do it. Her father told me that I never thought lawyers or law enforcement would care about a mentally handicapped black woman. It hurt me that he had to carry that with him. It broke my heart. I was very proud that we were able to get justice for her, show him that we did care deeply for your daughter. She was a beautiful woman. We fought hard for her, and now Kim will be held accountable for what she did.
As for Brian, he's moved on from the turmoil and found a silver lining in his life.
You know, they say time heals all wounds. It's a cliche, but I think every single day heals a little bit more. My kids have really taught me kind of.
Night settles differently over Cromwell Street. It doesn't fall all at once. It seeps in, slow, quiet, almost polite. The kind of night that doesn't announce itself, but instead presses gently against the windows, slipping through thin curtains, pooling in the corners of small rooms where no one thinks to look too closely. At number 25, the lights are still on. From the outside, it looks like any other working-class home in Gloucester. Brick walls weathered by time, a narrow entrance, curtains drawn just enough to suggest privacy, not secrecy. A place where a family lives. Where children laugh. Where meals are cooked, arguments flare, then fade into the routine silence of domestic life. A place that should feel safe. And yet, if you stood there long enough, longer than any passerby ever would, you might notice something strange. Not something you could easily name. Just a feeling. A stillness that feels too complete. As if the house itself is holding its breath. Inside, the air is heavy. There are footsteps upstairs. Slow. Measured. Not hurried, not panicked, just deliberate. The kind of movement that suggests control. Familiarity. Ownership. A door opens. Not wide. Just enough. And then, for a moment, there is a sound. It's not a scream. Not exactly. It's something softer, thinner. A broken attempt at one. The kind of sound that never travels far, swallowed almost instantly by walls that have learned how to keep secrets. The door closes again. Downstairs, everything remains still. The furniture sits in place. The clock ticks on the wall. Time continues, indifferent. Outside, a car passes, its headlights briefly brushing against the curtains before disappearing into the night. No one stops. No one notices. Because nothing about number 25, Cromwell Street demands attention. That's the first truth of this story. The most terrifying places rarely do. For nearly 2 decades, this house stood quietly among others just like it. Neighbors came and went. Children played in the street. People nodded to each other in passing, exchanged small talk, borrowed sugar, complained about the weather. Life unfolded in predictable, ordinary ways. And behind one of those doors, something else was unfolding too. Not in sudden bursts of chaos, but in slow, deliberate acts. Repeated. Refined. Hidden. A system. That's what makes this story different. Because this wasn't a single moment of violence. Not a crime of passion that erupted and ended in the same breath. This was something built over time. Layer by layer. Choice by choice. A pattern that grew in the dark. Fred West didn't look like a monster. If you passed him on the street, you might notice his broad frame, the way he carried himself with a certain rough confidence. Maybe you'd hear his voice, casual, unremarkable, the kind that blends easily into the background of everyday life. There was nothing about him that would make you stop and think twice. Nothing that would make you cross the street. Rose West didn't look like one either. She could smile. She could laugh. She could stand in a kitchen, making tea, exchanging polite conversation with neighbors, presenting a version of herself that felt familiar. Normal. Even warm, in fleeting moments. Together, they looked like a couple. A family. That's the second truth. Monsters rarely introduce themselves as monsters. They build lives. They form routines. They create environments where their darkness can exist unnoticed, even as it grows more extreme. Inside number 25, those routines were already in place. Doors that stayed locked. Rooms that weren't meant to be entered. Rules that weren't spoken out loud but were understood all the same. Invisible lines that no one was allowed to cross. And beneath it all, something buried. Not just metaphorically. Physically. Beneath the floorboards. Beneath the garden soil. Beneath the everyday life that continued on the surface, untouched and unquestioning. The house held secrets. Not just memories, not just moments, but bodies. Stories that had ended in silence, hidden away in the belief that no one would ever come looking closely enough to find them. And for years, no one did. That's what makes the opening of this story so unsettling. Not what happened in a single night, but what didn't happen over so many others. No alarms. No sudden revelations. No dramatic discovery that stopped everything in its tracks. Just time passing. Years stacking on top of each other. And inside that house, the pattern continuing. There is a tendency, when we look back at cases like this, to search for obvious signs. To imagine that there must have been something unmistakable. A moment when it all should have become clear. But the reality is quieter than that. It's neighbors who hear something strange and then dismiss it. It's small inconsistencies that don't quite add up, but never seem urgent enough to question. It's the human instinct to assume normalcy, even when something feels slightly off. Because normal is easier. Normal is comfortable. And number 25, Cromwell Street, for a very long time, was allowed to remain just that. Or at least, to appear that way. Inside, though, the truth was something else entirely. Upstairs, the footsteps stop. Another door opens. This time, it stays open a little longer. There's movement. A shifting of weight. The faint creak of old wood under pressure. And then, silence again. Thick, suffocating silence that seems to press against the walls themselves. If walls could speak, this house would have been screaming. But they didn't. They held everything in. Every sound. Every act. Every moment that should have shattered the illusion of normalcy but instead disappeared into the structure of the house, absorbed and buried like everything else. That's the third truth. Evil doesn't always need to hide very far. Sometimes, it just needs people to look away. And so the house stood. Day after day. Year after year. Children grew up inside it. Meals were cooked. Conversations were had. Laughter, real laughter, at times echoed through the same spaces that would later be uncovered as something far darker. Life and horror, existing side by side. Not separate. Not distinct. But intertwined. And that's what makes this story so difficult to process. Because there isn't a clear line where normal ends and something else begins. It blurs. It overlaps. It coexists. By the time anyone truly understood what had been happening inside number 25, it was already too late for many of the people whose lives had intersected with that house. Too late for the ones who had stepped through its doors and never stepped back out. Too late for the ones whose voices had been reduced to those brief, muffled sounds that never carried beyond the walls. Too late for the ones who had become part of the house itself. Buried. Hidden. Forgotten. Or at least, nearly forgotten. Because stories like this don't stay buried forever. Not completely. Eventually, something shifts. A detail emerges. A voice breaks through the silence. A single thread is pulled, and everything that was carefully concealed begins to unravel. But in the beginning, there is only the house. Standing quietly on Cromwell Street. Lights on. Curtains drawn. Holding its secrets. Waiting. Morning in Gloucester doesn't arrive with drama. It unfolds gently, as if the city itself prefers not to be disturbed. A pale grey light spreads slowly across rows of brick houses, settling into narrow streets where life begins in quiet, familiar rhythms. Curtains are drawn back. Doors open. People step out into the day with routines they've followed so many times before that they no longer think about them. Cromwell Street is one of those places where nothing seems to change, even as years pass. It isn't the kind of street that draws attention. No grand architecture. No historic landmarks. Just a row of modest homes pressed closely together, each one holding its own version of ordinary life. The pavement is uneven in places, worn down by decades of footsteps. The air carries the faint smell of damp brick and early morning coal smoke, depending on the season. It is, in every sense, unremarkable. And that is precisely why it worked. Because nothing about this environment suggests the possibility of something hidden beneath it. People here know each other, at least in the way neighbors do. They exchange nods, brief conversations, fragments of daily life. They notice when someone moves in or out, when a child grows older, when a family acquires a new car or lets the garden fall into neglect. But noticing is not the same as understanding. At number 25, the house blends seamlessly into this pattern. Its exterior carries no obvious warning signs. The bricks are aging like all the others. The windows are neither cleaner nor dirtier than the rest. From the outside, it tells the same story as every house on the street, that of a family living behind closed doors, managing their lives as best they can. Inside, however, the story begins to fracture. The layout of the house is simple, almost cramped. Narrow hallways. Low ceilings. Rooms that feel slightly too small for the number of people moving through them. It is the kind of space where privacy is limited, where sounds carry easily, where the presence of others is constant and unavoidable. And yet, within that limited space, there are divisions. Not physical walls, necessarily, but invisible boundaries. Areas that belong to certain people, and areas that do not. Doors that are sometimes open, sometimes closed, and sometimes locked without explanation. The house breathes in a rhythm that only a few truly understand. To the outside world, the West family presents something that resembles normality. Fred West moves through life with a rough, grounded presence. He works various jobs over the years, often involving manual labor. There is a physicality to him that people notice: broad shoulders, a way of standing that suggests he is comfortable taking up space. He can be sociable when it suits him, engaging in conversation without drawing too much attention to himself. There is nothing polished about him, nothing particularly refined, but that only makes him more familiar, more acceptable within the environment he inhabits. Rose West, younger by more than a decade, carries herself differently. There are moments when she appears almost soft-spoken, capable of slipping into the expected role of a mother, a partner, a woman managing a household. She interacts with neighbors, with acquaintances, in ways that do not immediately raise concern. There is a surface-level normalcy that holds, at least for those who never look beyond it. Together, they form something that, from a distance, resembles stability. But distance is key. Because proximity tells a different story. Inside the house, control is not subtle. It is woven into daily life in ways that shape everything. Fred's presence is dominant, not always through overt displays of violence, but through an underlying tension that lingers in the air. It is the kind of tension that doesn't need to be explained to be understood. It exists in the way conversations shift when he enters a room. In the way movements become more careful, more deliberate. In the way silence sometimes replaces what should have been ordinary interaction. Rose, over time, does not resist this dynamic. She becomes part of it. This is where the context of their lives becomes important, because nothing that happens inside number 25 exists in isolation. Both Fred and Rose come from backgrounds that are fractured in their own ways, shaped by instability, by experiences that distort boundaries and redefine what is acceptable. Fred's early life is marked by incidents that suggest a deeply troubling foundation. There are accounts of inappropriate relationships within his family, blurred lines that should never have been crossed. There is a head injury in his youth, often referenced in discussions about his behavior, though never fully understood in terms of its impact. What is clear is that by the time he reaches adulthood, his perception of control, of relationships, of power, is already warped. Rose's upbringing carries its own complexities. Growing up in an environment where structure and safety are inconsistent, she develops in ways that make her vulnerable to influence, to manipulation, to becoming part of something that might have once seemed unthinkable. When they meet in 1969, it is not an immediate explosion of violence. It is something quieter. A connection that forms, then deepens, then reshapes both of them. What emerges is not just a relationship, but a system. A shared understanding of behavior that exists outside the norms of the society around them. And within that system, the house becomes more than just a place to live. It becomes a space where rules are rewritten. Where control is absolute. Where the outside world fades, and what happens inside begins to operate on its own logic. Over time, the number of people moving through that house increases. Children are born. Others come and go. Some stay longer than they should. Some disappear without clear explanation. But disappearance, in a place like Cromwell Street, does not immediately trigger alarm. People move. People leave. Lives change direction without warning. In a working-class environment where stability is not guaranteed, absence does not always raise suspicion. It is easy to assume that someone has simply gone elsewhere, started over, vanished into the broader anonymity of the world. That assumption becomes one of the most powerful shields the house has. Because it allows patterns to form without being recognized as patterns. A young woman is seen entering the house, then not seen again. Another follows a similar path. The details are never quite clear enough, never quite urgent enough, to demand immediate attention. Each instance exists on its own, disconnected from the others in the minds of those observing from the outside. Inside, though, there is nothing random about it. There is intention. There is repetition. There is a method that evolves over time, becoming more refined, more controlled. The upper rooms of the house begin to take on a different significance. Spaces that might once have served ordinary purposes become something else entirely. Areas where control is exerted more directly, where the boundaries between people are enforced through fear, through force, through a level of domination that leaves no room for resistance. The basement, the garden, these parts of the property hold their own roles as well, though their true significance remains hidden for years. On the surface, they are just parts of a house. Storage space. Outdoor space. Nothing that would invite scrutiny. But beneath that surface, something else is taking shape. Something that requires concealment. Something that depends on the assumption that no one will look too closely. The longer this continues, the more embedded it becomes. It is no longer a series of isolated actions. It is a routine. A cycle that repeats itself with disturbing consistency. And still, the street remains quiet. Children play outside. Neighbors carry on with their lives. The rhythms of Gloucester continue unchanged, or at least, unchanged on the surface. This contrast is what makes the setting so unsettling. Because there is no dramatic divide between the ordinary and the horrific. They exist side by side, separated only by walls, by doors, by the simple fact that one is visible and the other is not. Number 25, Cromwell Street does not stand apart from its surroundings. It is part of them. Integrated. Accepted. Ignored. And within that acceptance, within that lack of scrutiny, the conditions are perfect for something to grow unchecked. Years pass. The house ages. The people inside it change, in ways both visible and invisible. And still, nothing breaks through. Not yet. Because the setting of this story is not just a place. It is a moment in time, a convergence of circumstances that allows something deeply abnormal to exist within the appearance of normal life. A city that does not see. A street that does not question. A house that does not reveal. At least, not until it can no longer keep its secrets buried. There is a tendency, when people revisit cases like this, to focus on the perpetrators so intensely that the victims become blurred at the edges, reduced to names in a list, numbers in a report, fragments of lives summarized in a few lines. But before anything else, before the house, before the pattern, before the horror that would come to define Cromwell Street, there were lives unfolding in ordinary ways, each one carrying its own hopes, its own direction, its own quiet sense of becoming. They were not meant to end here. Some of them arrived in Gloucester with the kind of optimism that doesn't announce itself loudly but sits quietly beneath the surface. Young women stepping into independence for the first time, leaving behind places that felt too small or too restrictive, looking for something undefined but necessary. Work, perhaps. Freedom. A version of life that belonged to them alone. They moved through train stations with small bags, through unfamiliar streets with a mix of caution and curiosity. They learned new routines, adapted to new environments, built connections where they could. In a place like Gloucester, those connections often formed quickly, out of necessity as much as desire. People shared spaces, rented rooms, crossed paths in ways that blurred the line between stranger and acquaintance. It is within that blurred space that vulnerability often lives. Some of the women who would eventually pass through number 25, Cromwell Street were, on the surface, exactly like countless others. They laughed easily. They made plans. They imagined futures that extended far beyond the narrow streets they were walking through in those moments. There were conversations about work, about relationships, about the small frustrations and small joys that make up daily life. Nothing about them suggested that their stories would be cut short in a place that no one had reason to fear. Others carried heavier histories. Lives that had already been shaped by instability, by moments of loss or disconnection that left them searching for something solid to hold on to. For some, that search led them into situations where trust was given too quickly, not out of naivety, but out of a need to believe that stability was possible. And sometimes, that belief is all it takes. Because the people who harm do not always present themselves as threats. They present themselves as opportunities, as solutions, as something that feels, at least initially, like a step forward rather than a step into danger. Inside the West household, that illusion was carefully maintained. There were rooms available. Space to stay. A place that could be framed as temporary shelter, as a practical arrangement in a world where housing was not always easy to secure. For a young woman navigating uncertainty, that offer could feel like relief. A door opening rather than closing. And so they stepped inside. Each one carrying her own story, her own set of expectations, her own understanding of what the next chapter of her life might look like. There is a quiet cruelty in the way those expectations were allowed to exist, even briefly. Because for a short time, normalcy could still be maintained. Conversations in the kitchen. Shared meals. The small, almost mundane interactions that create a sense of safety. It doesn't take much to build that sense, especially when someone wants to believe in it. But underneath, something else was already in motion. Control does not always begin with force. It begins with subtle shifts. Boundaries that move slightly, then slightly more. Rules that are introduced without being clearly defined. Expectations that are implied rather than stated outright. A door that is closed when it used to be open. A question that is answered with something less than truth. A moment where discomfort flickers, then is dismissed. For the victims of this story, those moments likely came in small, almost unnoticeable ways at first. A feeling that something was not quite right, but not wrong enough to trigger immediate alarm. Not yet. Because leaving is not always simple. Not when there is nowhere obvious to go. Not when the situation has already begun to tighten in ways that are difficult to articulate. And by the time the unease becomes something more concrete, the options have often already narrowed. Among all the victims, one story cuts through the rest with a particular kind of weight. Heather West. She was not someone who entered the house as a stranger. She did not arrive with uncertainty about where she was or who she was with. She was born into that environment, into the structure that had already begun to take shape long before she was old enough to understand it. Her world was defined by the walls of number 25. By the people inside it. By the rules that governed it. At 16, she existed at the edge of something that should have been freedom. That age where life begins to open up, where identity starts to take clearer form, where the future begins to feel like something you can reach toward rather than something that is decided for you. There are fragments of what her life might have looked like from the outside. A teenager navigating school, friendships, the small complexities of growing up. Moments that, in isolation, might have appeared entirely ordinary. But inside the house, those moments were not free from the influence of what existed beneath the surface. Control within a family does not always appear as it does from the outside. It can be disguised as discipline, as authority, as the expected dynamic between parent and child. It can be justified, normalized, absorbed into the structure of daily life until it no longer feels like something that can be questioned. For Heather, the boundaries of that control were not clearly defined. They shifted. They expanded. They became something else. What happened to her was not a sudden break from normalcy, but the culmination of a system that had been building for years. A system that did not distinguish between those outside the family and those within it when it came to power, to control, to the ability to decide who had autonomy and who did not. Her story is often told in the context of shock, of disbelief that parents could turn that kind of violence inward, toward their own child. But what makes it even more disturbing is how it fits into the larger pattern. Because in a system where control is absolute, where boundaries are already broken in other ways, the distinction between acceptable and unacceptable actions erodes completely. There is no line left to cross. Only actions to take. Heather's life, like the lives of the other victims, was not defined by the way it ended. It was defined by everything that came before. The moments that will never be fully known. The conversations that were never recorded. The thoughts, the feelings, the quiet hopes that existed independently of the environment that would ultimately take them away. This is the part of the story that is hardest to reconstruct. Not because it lacks importance, but because it is the most human part. The part that does not leave behind clear evidence or documented timelines. The part that exists in memory, in fragments, in the spaces between what can be proven and what can only be imagined. Who they were when they were alone. What they thought about when they looked toward the future. The small details that made them individuals rather than victims. And yet, even without knowing all of those details, there is something that remains clear. They trusted. At least, at some point. They stepped into a space that presented itself as something safe, or at least survivable. They engaged with people who did not immediately reveal the danger they represented. They existed within a context that did not signal, in any obvious way, the reality that lay beneath it. That is not a failure on their part. It is a reflection of how the system was designed to function. Because what happened inside number 25, Cromwell Street did not rely on force alone. It relied on access. On proximity. On the ability to draw people in without raising immediate suspicion. And once they were inside, once the boundaries had shifted just enough, once the sense of normalcy had been established and then quietly altered, the space for escape became smaller and smaller. Until, eventually, it disappeared entirely. The victims of this story are not defined by the horror that followed them into that house. They are defined by the lives they were living before they ever reached its door. Lives that should have continued. Lives that should have expanded outward, into futures that were never given the chance to exist. And that is the weight that sits at the center of this story. Not just what was done, but what was taken. Not just the violence, but the absence it created. Because long before number 25, Cromwell Street became known for what was hidden beneath it, it was simply a place where people walked in. And never walked out again. There is no single night that defines what happened inside number 25, Cromwell Street. No singular moment where everything begins. What happened there did not erupt. It unfolded. Slowly. Repeatedly. Almost methodically. The violence did not arrive like a storm. It settled in like something that had always been meant to exist in that space, growing more certain of itself with each passing year. If you try to imagine the beginning, it doesn't look dramatic. It looks ordinary. A conversation. An invitation. A door opening. A young woman stepping inside, carrying whatever version of her life she had at that moment. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she needed somewhere to stay. Maybe she trusted too easily, or maybe she simply didn't have better options. The details change from one victim to another, but the structure remains the same. Entry. That is always the first step. Inside, the house does not immediately reveal itself. There is no obvious shift, no sudden signal that something is wrong. The walls do not speak. The floors do not creak in warning. Everything appears functional, lived in, even mundane. And that is part of the design. Because the incident, as it unfolds again and again over the years, relies on that initial illusion. The sense that nothing here is out of place. That whatever unease might flicker briefly can be dismissed, rationalized, pushed aside. At first, there is interaction. Fred's presence is often the dominant one. He speaks with a casual familiarity that lowers defenses, that creates the impression of someone approachable, even helpful. There is a rough charm in the way he carries himself, something that can be mistaken for confidence or friendliness depending on how closely one looks. Rose is there too, sometimes in the background, sometimes closer, her role shifting depending on the moment. She is not separate from what is happening. She is part of it, though not always in ways that are immediately visible. The house breathes around them, holding the shape of normal life just long enough for it to feel real. But normal does not last. The shift is not always sudden. Sometimes it comes in increments so small they are almost invisible. A door that is closed behind someone, not aggressively, just firmly. A tone of voice that changes slightly, losing its warmth, gaining something else. A question that is no longer a question, but an expectation. Stay here. Wait. Do as you're told. Control does not need to announce itself loudly when it can be established quietly. And once it is there, once the balance has shifted even slightly, it becomes easier to push further. The rooms upstairs take on a different meaning at this point. They are no longer just spaces within a house. They become contained environments, separated from the rest of the world not just by walls, but by intention. Inside those rooms, time behaves differently. What happens there is not rushed. It does not need to be. There is no urgency, no fear of interruption that dictates speed. Instead, there is a kind of patience that makes everything more unsettling. Restraint is introduced. At first, it may be framed as something else. A misunderstanding. A moment that gets out of hand. But it does not stop there. It continues. It escalates. Hands become tools of control. So do objects. So does the space itself. The victims are no longer participants in a conversation. They are no longer guests, no longer individuals with autonomy. They are contained, managed, reduced to something that exists entirely within the control of the people around them. Fred's behavior in these moments is not chaotic. It is deliberate. There is an awareness in the way he moves, in the way he interacts with the person in front of him. This is not an act driven by sudden emotion. It is something practiced, something repeated enough times to become familiar. Rose is not absent from this. Her presence shifts between observer and participant, but she does not interrupt. She does not stop what is happening. Instead, she becomes part of the structure that allows it to continue. This is where the incident becomes something more than a single act of violence. It becomes a process. The victims are subjected to control that extends beyond physical restraint. There is psychological pressure, a dismantling of resistance that happens piece by piece. Fear is not just a reaction, it is cultivated, reinforced, used as a tool. Time stretches. Hours lose their shape. Day and night become less distinct. The outside world fades, replaced by the immediate reality of the room, the presence of the people who now hold complete power over what happens next. There are moments where resistance surfaces. It has to. No one enters that situation without the instinct to fight, to escape, to survive. But resistance is met with force. Not always explosive, not always loud, but effective. And over time, over hours or days, depending on the victim, that resistance is worn down. What follows is not a single act, but a series of them. Repeated violations that strip away autonomy, that reduce the person in front of them to something that exists solely within the boundaries set by their captors. This is the part of the story that is hardest to confront, not because it is unclear, but because it is systematic. Nothing about it is accidental. Nothing about it is out of control. It is control, in its most extreme form. Eventually, the process reaches its end. Not because something interrupts it, but because it is designed to end that way. The decision is made. The shift from control to finality is not marked by hesitation. It is another step in the pattern, one that has been approached gradually, inevitably. The method is often the same. Hands around a throat. Pressure applied with precision, with familiarity. It is not rushed. It does not need to be. The struggle that follows is brief, but intense. A final attempt by the body to resist what is happening, to hold on to life even as it is being taken away. And then, stillness. Silence returns to the room, but it is a different kind of silence now. Heavier. More complete. What was once a person, with thoughts, with a future, with a life that extended beyond these walls, is now something else. An absence. And yet, even here, the process is not over. Because what happens next is just as deliberate as everything that came before. The body is not left where it falls. It is handled. Moved. Managed with a level of detachment that speaks to repetition, to experience. There is no panic. No sense of urgency. Only action. The house, once again, becomes part of the process. Spaces that were designed for ordinary purposes are used for something else entirely. Floors conceal. Walls hide. The garden absorbs. Each act of concealment is another layer added to the system, another measure taken to ensure that what has happened remains hidden, contained within the boundaries of number 25. And then, when it is done, when everything has been put back into place, when the visible signs have been removed or hidden, life resumes. Downstairs, the house looks the same. The kitchen remains the kitchen. The front room remains the front room. The street outside continues without interruption. And inside, the pattern resets. Ready to begin again. This is what defines the incident within this story. Not a single act, but a repetition of acts. Not a moment, but a cycle. Each victim passing through the same structure, experiencing variations of the same controlled, deliberate process that begins with entry and ends in silence. Over time, the details may shift slightly. The methods may refine. The confidence of those in control may grow. But the core remains unchanged. Invitation. Containment. Control. Violation. Finality. Concealment. And then, once everything is hidden again, the house waits. For the next person to walk through the door. 4 years, nothing at number 25, Cromwell Street forced anyone to look closer. There were no flashing signals, no undeniable moment that broke through the surface and demanded immediate attention. Just fragments. Small, disconnected details that hovered at the edge of awareness, never quite forming a complete picture. A neighbor might remember seeing a young woman entering the house, her face unfamiliar, her presence temporary. Days later, she would no longer be there. But people come and go. That's what everyone tells themselves. In a place like Gloucester, movement is constant, explanations are optional, and absence is rarely questioned for long. Someone else might recall raised voices through the walls, the kind that make you pause for a second before deciding it's not your business. Arguments happen. Families fight. Doors slam. Silence follows. Life goes on. And so the house remained what it appeared to be. Until 1994. The shift, when it finally came, did not begin with a body. It did not begin with a discovery beneath the floorboards or in the garden. It began with a voice. One of the West children stepped forward. Not with certainty, not with a full understanding of everything that had happened, but with something that could no longer be contained. An accusation. A fragment of truth that, once spoken aloud, could not be taken back. It was directed at Fred. Allegations of sexual abuse. At first, it was treated as a serious but contained matter, the kind of case that law enforcement encounters regularly enough to follow established procedures. Investigate the claim. Gather statements. Build a timeline. Determine whether there is enough evidence to proceed. But something about this case did not sit neatly within those boundaries. There were inconsistencies, details that didn't align in simple ways. A sense that the accusation was not an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something that had not yet been fully uncovered. When investigators began to look more closely at the household, they were not immediately searching for multiple victims buried beneath the property. That possibility was too extreme, too far removed from what they had been presented with initially. Instead, they started with what they had. They spoke to people. They listened. And slowly, more fragments began to surface. Stories that had once seemed unrelated started to echo each other. Names that had faded into the background of memory were brought forward again. Young women who had been seen at the house, who had interacted with the family, who had then disappeared without clear explanation. Each individual piece, on its own, was not enough to confirm anything beyond suspicion. But together, they began to form a pattern. A pattern that pointed back to the same place. Number 25, Cromwell Street. The decision to search the property did not happen all at once. It built gradually, as the weight of those fragments became harder to ignore, as the possibility of something far more serious took shape in the minds of the investigators. When they finally stepped onto the property with that intention, the house still looked the same. There was no visible sign of what lay beneath it. No obvious indication that the ground itself held anything beyond soil and stone. The first stages of the search were cautious, measured. Investigators moved through the house, documenting, observing, taking in details that might have once seemed insignificant. The layout, the condition of the rooms, the way certain spaces felt slightly out of place, though not in ways that could immediately be defined. It is often said that experienced investigators develop an instinct, a sense of when something is not right even if they cannot yet prove it. Whether that instinct was present here or not, the decision was made to dig. Not everywhere. Not yet. Specific areas were identified based on the information they had gathered, on the fragments that had begun to align into something more concrete. The garden was one of the first places they focused on. At a glance, it was unremarkable. Soil, patches of uneven ground, the kind of outdoor space that could easily go unnoticed among hundreds of similar properties. Nothing about it suggested that it had been disturbed in any meaningful way. But appearances, as this case would prove again and again, were unreliable. The process of excavation began slowly, carefully. Each layer of soil removed with attention to detail, with the understanding that if something was there, it needed to be uncovered in a way that preserved whatever evidence remained. At first, there was nothing. Just dirt. Just the expected resistance of ground that had settled over time. And then, something changed. It was not dramatic. Not at first. A difference in texture. A shape that did not belong. Something that interrupted the natural pattern of the soil. The moment of realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It came gradually, as the shape became clearer, as the possibility solidified into something undeniable. Bone. The first discovery is always the one that shifts everything. Up until that point, there is still room for uncertainty, for the possibility that the investigation might lead in a different direction. But once human remains are found, that uncertainty disappears. The case changes instantly. What had been an investigation into abuse became something else entirely. Something far larger. The excavation continued. And with it, the discoveries. One set of remains did not stand alone. It led to another. And then another. Each one carefully uncovered, documented, removed with the understanding that they represented not just evidence, but lives that had been hidden, erased, buried in a way that suggested they were never meant to be found. The garden was not the only place. As the search expanded, attention turned to the house itself. Floors were examined more closely. Areas that had once seemed structurally unremarkable were reassessed with new understanding. The possibility that the concealment extended beyond the soil outside became increasingly likely. And it did. Beneath the structure of the house, within the spaces that had been part of daily life for years, more remains were found. The scale of it became impossible to ignore. This was not a single incident. Not an isolated act. It was a pattern that had been sustained over time, hidden with a level of confidence that suggested the perpetrators believed it would never be uncovered. As each discovery was made, the weight of the case grew. Investigators were no longer piecing together fragments. They were uncovering a reality that had existed in plain sight, concealed not by distance or complexity, but by the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see it. The house itself became something different in that moment. No longer just a location. It became a crime scene of extraordinary scale. Every room, every surface, every part of the structure held potential significance. The walls, the floors, the spaces in between them were no longer neutral. They were part of the story, part of the mechanism that had allowed everything to remain hidden for so long. Outside, the street began to change as well. Word spread. At first, in small, uncertain ways. Then more quickly, as the reality of what was being uncovered became clear. Neighbors who had lived alongside number 25 for years found themselves looking at it differently, re-evaluating memories, reconsidering moments that had once seemed insignificant. The ordinary was no longer ordinary. It was recontextualized, transformed by the knowledge of what had been there all along. For the investigators, the process was far from over. Each set of remains needed to be identified. Each discovery needed to be connected to a person, to a story, to a life that had been interrupted. That process would take time. Careful analysis. Patience. But the initial discovery had already accomplished something irreversible. It had exposed the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to ensure that what had been hidden beneath number 25, Cromwell Street for so many years would never be buried again. Once the first remains were uncovered beneath 25, Cromwell Street, the investigation stopped being about suspicion and became about scale. What had begun as a domestic allegation was now a developing scene of mass concealment, and with that shift came urgency, pressure, and a kind of investigative disbelief that even experienced officers struggled to fully suppress. But the human mind resists large truths at first. It prefers smaller explanations, more manageable possibilities. Even standing in that garden, watching soil being carefully removed layer by layer, some investigators initially held onto the idea that this might still be limited in scope. A tragic but contained case. A few victims. A single sequence of crimes that could be mapped, understood, closed. That belief did not survive long. As more excavation took place, the pattern refused to remain small. Each discovery forced a recalibration of expectation. Each set of remains widened the gap between what had been assumed and what was actually there. And with every new finding, the question changed from how did this happen to something far more difficult to answer: how did this remain hidden for so long? The early phase of the investigation focused heavily on Fred and Rose West themselves. Their names had already surfaced through the initial allegation, but now they became the center of everything. Officers began reconstructing their lives, not as neighbors, not as a family, but as subjects of scrutiny. Fred's history revealed instability that did not fully explain what was being uncovered, but added weight to the concern that something had long been wrong beneath the surface. Prior convictions for sexual offenses, accounts of controlling and aggressive behavior, and a pattern of relationships marked by imbalance all began to form a partial outline. It was not yet a complete picture, but it was enough to suggest familiarity with coercion and violence. Rose, initially more difficult to define, presented a different challenge for investigators. There was less documented about her in official records, fewer overt indicators of criminal behavior. To many outside observers, she still appeared as a mother, a partner, a woman who had lived within the same household structure for years. That contrast created tension within the investigation itself, because the emerging physical evidence suggested participation on a level that did not align easily with that external image. This is where investigative work becomes psychologically complex. Evidence in the ground does not come with explanations. It only confirms that something happened. Assigning responsibility, reconstructing intent, understanding participation, these require movement through layers of testimony, behavior analysis, and inference. And in this case, those layers were deeply entangled. As interviews expanded, a fragmented portrait of the household began to form. Former associates, neighbors, individuals who had interacted with the West family over the years were brought in to give statements. Their memories were not always clear, but they carried patterns of discomfort that, when viewed collectively, became significant. There were mentions of young women staying at the house for periods of time and then disappearing from view. There were vague recollections of arguments, of tension, of an atmosphere that people could not quite define but sometimes chose to ignore. There were also accounts that contradicted each other, as memory often does when it is not anchored by clear understanding at the time of observation. Investigators had to separate noise from signal. Not every missing person report connected to the house was immediately relevant, but each one was reviewed. Not every memory indicated criminal behavior, but each one contributed to the broader environment surrounding the case. The challenge was not just finding evidence, but organizing it into something coherent enough to withstand legal scrutiny. Inside the investigation team, there was also a growing awareness that they were dealing with something that may have extended over decades. That realization introduced a different kind of pressure. Time itself became part of the problem. Evidence had decayed. Memories had faded. People who might have seen or known something years earlier were no longer accessible. The house, in contrast, had preserved its secrets with unsettling efficiency. As excavation continued, forensic teams worked carefully to document every layer. Soil samples were catalogued. Remains were carefully removed and transported for analysis. The process was slow, deliberate, and emotionally taxing. Even for professionals accustomed to difficult scenes, the cumulative weight of repeated discoveries created a sense of psychological strain that was hard to avoid. Each set of remains required identification. That meant waiting for forensic anthropology, dental records, and eventually DNA analysis to provide answers. Until then, each victim existed in a kind of suspended state within the investigation, known but not yet named, present but not yet returned to their identity. That gap between discovery and identification became one of the most difficult aspects of the case. It was not just about uncovering what happened, but about restoring individuality to people who had been deliberately hidden. Meanwhile, the investigation into Fred and Rose intensified. Their movements were tracked retrospectively. Their interactions with others were mapped across time. Patterns began to emerge that suggested a level of consistency in behavior that had previously gone unnoticed or unchallenged. Certain individuals who had been in contact with them over the years became points of interest, not because they were necessarily involved, but because they helped define the social and environmental context in which the crimes occurred. One of the most important challenges for investigators was determining how much each of the Wests had contributed to the acts being uncovered. This was not simply a matter of assigning blame, but of understanding operational dynamics within the household. Who initiated what actions? Who participated directly? Who enabled, facilitated, or concealed? These distinctions mattered legally, but they also mattered for understanding the structure of control that had existed inside the home. Statements began to emerge that suggested the presence of coercion within the household itself, but not in a simple or linear form. Some accounts indicated fear. Others suggested complicity. Still others pointed toward a relationship dynamic that blurred traditional categories of perpetrator and participant. None of these explanations were sufficient on their own, but together they painted a picture of a system rather than a single actor. The investigation team found themselves repeatedly returning to the physical space of the house. Not just the garden or the basement, but the entire structure. Each room was re-examined with the knowledge of what had been found beneath it. Floors were no longer just floors. Walls were no longer just boundaries. Everything became potentially relevant. Even mundane objects took on new significance when viewed through that lens. A piece of furniture, a section of flooring, a sealed area that had once been considered insignificant could now be reconsidered as part of a larger concealment strategy. At the same time, media attention began to intensify. As information about the discoveries spread, public interest grew rapidly. The case moved from local concern to national focus. That attention brought both assistance and complication. On one hand, it encouraged witnesses to come forward. On the other, it increased pressure on investigators, adding urgency to a process that required careful, deliberate work. Within the West household itself, the immediate dynamic was collapsing. Once both Fred and Rose were under suspicion, the structure that had allowed their lives to continue uninterrupted for so long could no longer function in the same way. Each was now subject to separate lines of questioning, separate evaluations of responsibility, separate attempts to reconstruct timelines of events. And yet, despite increasing scrutiny, full clarity remained elusive. Not because evidence was absent, but because the scale of what had been uncovered resisted simple explanation. The investigation was no longer just about identifying victims. It was about reconstructing an entire hidden history that had existed parallel to everyday life in Gloucester for nearly 2 decades. And with each new discovery, the question became more pressing, not just of what had happened, but how it had been allowed to continue, unnoticed, for so long in plain sight. There are moments in every major investigation when the case stops expanding outward and instead turns inward, tightening around a single point where everything begins to converge. For the investigation into 25 Cromwell Street, that moment did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden breakthrough in a single piece of evidence. It came through accumulation, through pressure building across multiple fronts until the structure of denial, inconsistency, and silence simply could not hold anymore. By the time Fred West was formally arrested, the case had already transformed into something far larger than any initial allegation. The excavation had revealed multiple sets of human remains. Forensic teams were working through identities that would take time to confirm. Witness statements, fragmented but increasingly consistent, were painting a picture of sustained patterns of abuse, control, and disappearance that extended far beyond what had first been suspected. The arrest itself was procedural in appearance, but in reality it marked a rupture. Fred was no longer operating within the space of ambiguity where explanations could be shaped or controlled. He was now inside a system designed to strip away those possibilities, to test every statement against physical evidence that was already being recovered from beneath his own property. In custody, his demeanor did not initially match the scale of what was unfolding outside. There was no immediate confession, no visible collapse under the weight of discovery. Instead, there was a kind of guarded pragmatism, an attempt to remain in control of the narrative even as the narrative itself was dissolving. Investigators quickly realized that the challenge was not simply obtaining information, but navigating a mindset that did not respond in predictable ways to confrontation. Interviews with Fred became exercises in contradiction management. He would acknowledge certain facts while denying others, shift between partial admissions and outright refusal, and attempt to reframe events in ways that minimized his involvement. At the same time, forensic findings were accelerating. Each new identification added irreversible weight to the case. Victims were no longer abstract discoveries beneath soil or floorboards. They were becoming individuals again, each with a name, a background, a life that could be partially reconstructed through records and family testimony. This process had a profound impact not only on the investigation but on its emotional tone. What had once been a technical search for evidence was becoming a collective confrontation with loss. Rose West, meanwhile, was brought into separate questioning. Her position within the household made her role central to understanding the full scope of events. Unlike Fred, whose prior criminal history had already placed him under suspicion, Rose initially presented a more ambiguous challenge for investigators. Her responses were controlled, often measured, and at times emotionally detached in ways that complicated interpretation. One of the key difficulties in interrogating her was the absence of clear alignment with expected behavioral responses. Where investigators anticipated either denial or emotional breakdown, they instead encountered a consistent composure that made it difficult to extract clarity. This did not imply innocence, nor did it confirm guilt in isolation, but it did create additional layers of complexity in evaluating her involvement. As questioning continued, the investigative strategy shifted. Rather than relying solely on direct confrontation, Authorities began building a detailed reconstruction of timelines, cross-referencing statements with physical evidence and witness accounts. This approach gradually reduced the space in which contradiction could exist. The turning point in the broader case did not come from a single statement but from the convergence of multiple strands of evidence that could no longer be separated from each other. The forensic results from the Cromwell Street property, combined with corroborating testimonies and behavioral inconsistencies in interviews, created a framework that was increasingly difficult to dispute. Fred, under sustained pressure, began to provide more fragmented admissions. These were not structured confessions in the traditional sense. They were partial acknowledgments, often limited to specific incidents rather than the broader pattern that investigators were attempting to establish. However, even these partial statements were significant, because they confirmed involvement in ways that could be directly linked to physical evidence already recovered. Rose's interrogation followed a different trajectory. While she continued to resist full acknowledgement of responsibility, the consistency of the forensic findings reduced the effectiveness of denial. As more victims were identified and linked to the household, the scope of potential explanations narrowed. The gap between her statements and the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile within any coherent alternative narrative. What emerged during this phase was not a sudden revelation of truth, but a gradual dismantling of the structures that had allowed that truth to remain obscured. Investigators were no longer searching for confirmation of whether crimes had occurred. That question had already been answered. The focus had shifted to establishing responsibility, understanding the sequence of events, and determining the extent of participation within the household dynamic. As the case progressed toward prosecution, legal teams began preparing for what would become one of the most complex trials in modern British criminal history. The number of victims, the span of time involved, and the nature of the concealment all contributed to a case that required meticulous presentation of evidence. Every discovery from Cromwell Street had to be contextualized, verified, and connected to specific charges. Fred West eventually faced formal charges relating to multiple counts of murder. The weight of evidence against him had become overwhelming, not in a single dramatic moment, but through cumulative validation across forensic, testimonial, and circumstantial domains. His legal position deteriorated rapidly as the prosecution built a case that left increasingly little room for ambiguity. Rose West was also charged, marking a critical expansion of the case from individual perpetrator to shared responsibility within a domestic structure. This aspect of the prosecution was particularly significant, as it required demonstrating not only direct involvement but also complicity within a sustained pattern of criminal activity. Throughout this period, public attention intensified further. The case had already moved beyond local or even national interest and had become a focal point of international scrutiny. The idea that such extensive crimes could have occurred undetected within a residential street for so long challenged fundamental assumptions about safety, community observation, and the limits of perception. Within legal proceedings, however, the focus remained strictly evidentiary. Emotion, while unavoidable in public discourse, had to be carefully managed within the courtroom. The priority was to establish facts that could withstand legal scrutiny, regardless of external reaction. As the prosecution prepared to present its full case, one element became increasingly clear. The investigation had succeeded not because of a single breakthrough, but because of persistence across multiple domains of inquiry. It was the integration of forensic science, witness testimony, behavioral analysis, and sustained investigative pressure that ultimately brought the case into a form that could be prosecuted. Yet even as the legal process moved forward, there remained a sense among those involved that full comprehension of what had occurred might never be entirely possible. Not because of lack of evidence, but because of the sheer duration and concealment of events within a seemingly ordinary environment. The breakthrough, therefore, was not just the discovery of truth, but the point at which denial could no longer structurally survive contact with accumulated reality. From that point forward, the case was no longer about uncovering what had happened. It was about confronting it in full view of a system that could finally no longer look away. The courtroom in Bristol did not feel like a place built for stories of this magnitude. It felt too ordinary for what it contained. Wooden benches polished by years of use. Pale walls that had witnessed countless smaller disputes, thefts, assaults, arguments that ended in fines or short sentences. Nothing in its architecture suggested that it would become the stage for one of the most disturbing cases in modern British legal history. Yet on the day the trial began, it carried a weight that seemed to press down on every surface inside it. The case of Fred and Rose West had already been defined in the public imagination before the first witness spoke. The discovery at 25, Cromwell Street had shifted from investigation to national shock, and now it had entered its final phase, judgment through law. But the law does not move at the speed of emotion. It moves through structure, through procedure, through carefully constructed arguments designed to survive scrutiny. And so, despite everything already known outside the courtroom, inside it the story had to be rebuilt piece by piece, in a form that could be formally examined. The prosecution began with restraint. There was no need for exaggeration. The evidence itself carried enough weight. They described the house first, not as a narrative device, but as a framework. A location where events had taken place over an extended period of time, where multiple victims had been identified, and where concealment had been systematic rather than incidental. Photographs were introduced. Reports were read. Forensic findings were presented in clinical detail, each one anchoring the case in physical reality. The soil samples. The skeletal remains. The locations within the property where each discovery had been made. Each piece of evidence removed abstraction from the case and replaced it with certainty. As the prosecution built its argument, the courtroom remained largely silent. There were no dramatic interruptions, no visible reactions from the jury that could be easily interpreted. Instead, there was a kind of sustained stillness, as if everyone present understood that what they were hearing required absorption rather than response. When victim identities were introduced, the tone shifted subtly. No longer just remains, each individual was restored to identity. Names were spoken. Backgrounds were described. Families were acknowledged. The courtroom became a space where absence was given form again, even if only briefly, through language. This process had a dual effect. It grounded the evidence in human reality, and it also intensified the emotional weight of what had occurred. Because each name represented not just a victim, but a life interrupted in ways that the legal language alone could never fully capture. The defense strategies for both Fred and Rose diverged in tone but converged in purpose. Fred's legal position attempted to challenge aspects of intent and responsibility, focusing on inconsistencies in witness accounts and questioning the interpretation of certain forensic findings. There was an effort to create doubt where absolute certainty was difficult to establish in isolation. Rose's defense, on the other hand, leaned heavily on the ambiguity of her role within the household. It emphasized absence of direct evidence linking her to specific acts of violence, and sought to separate proximity from participation. But the prosecution had already constructed its argument in a way that accounted for these distinctions. The strength of the case did not rest on a single event or a single witness. It rested on convergence. Multiple victims. Multiple locations within the same property. Consistent patterns of behavior across years. The repeated use of the same environment for concealment. The overlap between opportunity, access, and control. Individually, each element could be questioned. Together, they formed something far more difficult to dismantle. Witness testimony from individuals connected to the West family added further texture to the proceedings. Former acquaintances described interactions that, at the time, had seemed unremarkable but now carried new significance. Moments that had once been dismissed as uncomfortable or unusual were re-evaluated in light of what was now known. The courtroom also heard accounts that spoke to the atmosphere surrounding the household. Not always direct observations of crime, but impressions. Feelings of unease. Boundaries that felt unclear. Situations that did not make immediate sense but were never pursued further at the time. These testimonies reinforced a broader theme that ran through the entire case, that the environment in which these crimes occurred had been allowed to persist not through secrecy alone, but through a combination of invisibility and normalization. As the trial progressed, Fred West's behavior in court remained controlled in a way that complicated interpretation. There was no visible breakdown, no dramatic confession, no emotional display that aligned with external expectations of guilt. Instead, there was a measured presence that occasionally conflicted with the gravity of the evidence being presented. Rose maintained a similarly restrained demeanor, though the meaning of that restraint was interpreted differently by observers depending on their perspective. What the courtroom could not easily resolve was the internal dynamic between the two defendants. The extent to which actions were shared, directed, or enabled remained a central question throughout the proceedings. The legal system required clarity in terms of responsibility, but the structure of their relationship resisted simple categorization. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution returned to the central theme of the case: sustained, concealed, and systematic criminal conduct over an extended period of time. They emphasized that the evidence did not point to isolated incidents, but to an ongoing pattern that had been maintained within a domestic environment that provided both access and concealment. The defense, in their final submissions, reiterated their challenges to interpretation, urging the jury to distinguish between implication and proof beyond reasonable doubt. But by that stage, the accumulation of evidence had already shaped the direction of the trial in ways that could not easily be reversed. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom entered a different kind of silence. Not the silence of presentation, but the silence of waiting. Outside, the world continued as usual. Inside, time became suspended. Hours passed. Then days. The deliberation process was not visible, but its weight was felt throughout the building. Each hour that passed without a verdict extended the tension, not because of uncertainty about evidence, but because of the seriousness of what the decision represented. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere shifted immediately. There was no need for prolonged anticipation. The verdicts were delivered in sequence, each one marking a point of irreversible conclusion. Fred West was found guilty of multiple counts of murder. Rose West was also found guilty of multiple counts of murder. The legal language was precise, but its implications extended far beyond the courtroom. It marked the formal recognition of responsibility for a series of crimes that had been concealed for years within a single residential property. In Fred's case, there would be no sentencing phase. He died in custody shortly before the trial concluded, removing the possibility of a formal sentence being delivered in court. Rose West, however, received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of release. The conclusion of the trial did not bring resolution in the emotional sense. It brought closure in the legal sense, which is different, more defined, but not necessarily complete. For the families of the victims, the verdict represented recognition, accountability, and confirmation of what had long been suspected but not fully proven. It did not restore what had been lost, but it did establish, within the structure of law, that what had occurred was real, documented, and acknowledged. As the courtroom emptied, there was no sense of celebration. Only the quiet aftermath of something that had finally reached its formal end. And outside, Cromwell Street still existed, unchanged in structure, but permanently altered in meaning. When a case reaches its end in court, there is an expectation that something inside the world will also feel resolved. That truth will settle the mind, close the wound, allow people to move forward with clarity. But in reality, especially in cases like this, the legal ending is only one layer of closure. It is the moment when society formally acknowledges what has already been discovered, not the moment when the emotional or human impact stops echoing. After the trial of Fred and Rose West, what remained was not silence, but aftermath. The house at 25, Cromwell Street stood for a short time after everything was exposed, still physically present but no longer able to exist as it once had. It had already been transformed in meaning. What had once been an ordinary-looking family home had become something irreversible in the public imagination, a place where hidden violence had taken root over years without interruption. Even if the walls remained intact, the identity of the structure itself had collapsed. Eventually, it was demolished. Not as an act of erasure, but as an acknowledgement that some spaces cannot return to normal function after what they have contained. The physical removal of the building did not remove memory. It did not undo what had been discovered beneath it. Instead, It marked a transition from physical site to historical reference, from location to symbol. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was far more complex than the legal outcome suggested. The return of names, the identification of remains, and the confirmation of what had happened provided answers that had been absent for years. But answers are not the same as resolution. They do not restore presence. They do not reverse absence. They simply define it. Each identified victim represented both closure and reopening. Closure in the sense that uncertainty was replaced with knowledge. Reopening in the sense that knowledge brings its own form of grief, sharper in some ways than not knowing at all. The reality of what had occurred became something that had to be integrated into memory, into family history, into lives that had already continued forward in the absence of those individuals. There is also the broader impact, the one that extends beyond those directly connected to the victims. Cases like this alter the way communities understand safety, not in an abstract sense, but in a deeply practical one. They force a re-evaluation of assumptions that most people rely on without thinking. The assumption that violence is visible, that danger is distant, that normal appearances reflect normal realities. Cromwell Street disrupted those assumptions completely. It demonstrated that extended periods of concealment are possible within ordinary environments. That proximity does not guarantee awareness. That people can live side by side with extreme acts without recognizing them, not because they are indifferent, but because the signs do not always present themselves in ways that demand immediate interpretation. In the years following the case, discussions about investigative procedures, social awareness, and institutional response became part of its legacy. Not because the system had entirely failed, but because the case revealed gaps that had allowed such extensive concealment to persist. It became a reference point in criminology, in law enforcement training, in discussions about how patterns of disappearance are identified and connected. But even within those professional contexts, there is an acknowledgement that no system can fully eliminate the possibility of hidden harm. What can be improved is recognition, attention, the willingness to question when something does not fully align with expectation, even if it appears small or uncertain. Fred West's death in custody before the conclusion of legal proceedings left an unresolved element in terms of formal sentencing, but it did not alter the established findings of the court. His role in the crimes had been legally affirmed through evidence and verdict. Rose West's life sentence ensured continued legal accountability, but like all such sentences, it exists within the structure of punishment rather than restoration. Over time, the case has remained present in public memory not because of its procedural details, but because of what it revealed about the intersection between normal life and concealed violence. It is not remembered as a distant historical anomaly, but as something that occurred within familiar conditions. A residential street, a family home, a community environment that did not appear, on the surface, to contain anything extraordinary. That contrast is what continues to define its impact. There is no final explanation that fully resolves why it was able to continue for so long without interruption. No single point of failure that can be isolated as the sole cause. Instead, there is a combination of factors: social assumptions, fragmented observations, limited communication between different points of awareness, and the inherent difficulty of interpreting isolated incidents as part of a larger pattern before that pattern becomes visible in full. The aftermath of the case also extends into the way victims are remembered. In many cases, recognition arrives too late to change outcomes, but not too late to restore identity. Each person uncovered from the Cromwell Street site was eventually reconnected to a name, a history, and a place within their own narrative. That act of restoration, while not reversing what happened, ensured that they were not left as anonymous fragments within a criminal record. And that matters. Because one of the most important elements of any true crime case is not only understanding what was done, but recognizing who it was done to. Not as symbols, not as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were interrupted within a system that allowed that interruption to remain hidden for far too long. In reflecting on this case, what remains most significant is not just the scale of the crimes, but the environment in which they occurred. The fact that such events did not take place in isolation, but within a space that existed in everyday view. That is what continues to unsettle public perception even decades later. It forces a difficult recognition. That safety is often assumed, not confirmed. That familiarity can obscure reality. That ordinary settings can contain extraordinary harm without immediate detection. And yet, despite everything, there is also a different kind of lesson embedded within the aftermath. Not one of fear, but of awareness. The understanding that attention matters. That listening to discomfort, even when it is unclear, has value. That patterns sometimes only become visible when individual observations are not dismissed too quickly. The story of Fred and Rose West does not end with a sense of completion. It ends with acknowledgement. Of victims. Of failures in perception. Of the limits of visibility within human environments. And long after the house was gone, long after the trial concluded, long after the names were spoken in court, what remains is not the structure that once stood on Cromwell Street, but the reminder of what it concealed. A reminder that some truths do not announce themselves. They wait. Until someone finally looks closely enough to see them. In the end, what remains of a case like this is not the violence itself, but the silence it leaves behind once everything has been uncovered. Silence in the legal sense. Silence in the physical sense, after the house has been torn down. Silence in the emotional sense, which lingers long after the facts are no longer uncertain. The story of Fred and Rose West does not conclude in a way that offers comfort, because it was never a story that contained comfort to begin with. It concludes in recognition. In exposure. In the slow, irreversible removal of denial. But recognition is not the same as understanding. Even now, years later, the question that lingers is not what happened inside 25, Cromwell Street, because that has been established with forensic certainty. The question is how something so extensive could remain embedded within an ordinary environment for so long without interruption. How daily life continued in parallel with concealed violence. How proximity did not translate into awareness. There is no single answer to that question. Only layers of partial explanation. Human assumptions. Social fragmentation. The natural tendency to interpret disturbing signs individually rather than as part of a larger structure. The discomfort people feel when something seems slightly wrong, and the equally human instinct to rationalize that discomfort away. That combination is what allowed the house to remain unnoticed in the way that it did. But to reduce the entire story to systems and failures would be to overlook something essential. Because at the center of this case are not abstract mechanisms, but people. Individuals whose lives were interrupted, redirected, and ended within a space that should have been ordinary. They are the only part of this story that deserves permanence. Not the perpetrators. Not the structure of the crime. Not the investigative complexity. Those elements belong to history, to analysis, to the study of how such events unfold. The victims belong to memory. And memory does not operate like evidence. It does not require corroboration. It does not diminish over time in the same way physical traces do. It persists in fragments, in names, in the effort to ensure that what happened to them is not reduced to silence. That is why cases like this continue to be revisited, even decades later. Not out of fascination with violence, but out of obligation to those whose lives were absorbed into it. Each retelling is an attempt to restore context, to resist the flattening effect of time, to ensure that the individuals involved are not lost within the scale of the crime. There is also something unsettling that remains even after everything has been explained. A kind of residual awareness that ordinary spaces are not always as transparent as they appear. That familiarity does not guarantee safety. That the surface of daily life can conceal realities that do not align with expectation. This is not meant to create fear, but awareness. A recognition that human environments are layered, and that what is visible is not always complete. The demolition of 25, Cromwell Street did not erase what happened there. It simply removed the physical container. The events that occurred within it remain fixed in time, documented, investigated, confirmed. What was buried has been brought into the open, and cannot return to obscurity. But even with that exposure, the emotional weight of the case does not fully dissipate. It shifts from discovery to reflection, from investigation to memory, from questions of what happened to questions of how it was experienced by those who never had the chance to speak for themselves again. Fred West's death in custody closed one legal path, but it did not close the narrative. Rose West's imprisonment continues as a formal consequence, but consequences are not equivalent to resolution. They are structural responses to acts that remain, in human terms, irreparable. And perhaps that is the final point that this case leaves behind. That some events do not resolve. They settle. They are acknowledged. They are contained within legal frameworks. But they do not become undone. Instead, they become part of the record of what is possible within human behavior, and what must therefore be remembered, not to sensationalize, but to understand the limits of assumption. Because if there is a lesson that extends beyond this case, it is not about the individuals who committed these acts. It is about the environments in which such acts were allowed to remain hidden, and the importance of attention to what does not immediately make sense. Not every discomfort is evidence of something grave. Not every irregularity signals danger. But some patterns only become visible when small signals are not ignored repeatedly over time. That is where awareness begins. Not in certainty, but in attention. The story of Cromwell Street ends, formally, with demolition, sentencing, and historical record. But informally, it continues in a different form. In how it is remembered. In how it is studied. In how it influences the way similar signs are interpreted elsewhere. And in that sense, it does not end at all. It transforms. From a place. Into a warning. From a case. Into a reminder. That even within the most ordinary settings, reality can contain depths that are not immediately visible. And that what is not seen, if left unexamined for too long, can exist far longer than anyone expects. There is a point, after all the evidence has been examined, all the testimonies recorded, all the legal decisions delivered, where a case like this stops belonging to the present and begins to settle into something else entirely. Not closure. Not resolution. Something quieter. Something more permanent. The story of Fred and Rose West has long since moved beyond the boundaries of investigation or trial. It now exists in a different space, one shared between history and memory, where facts are fixed but meaning continues to shift depending on who is reflecting on them. For those who worked the case, it remains a reference point for the limits of perception. A reminder that even the most ordinary environments can conceal realities that defy expectation. For forensic professionals, it is studied as an example of sustained concealment within a domestic setting, where physical space itself was used as part of the method of hiding what had been done. For the public, it exists as something harder to categorize. Not quite distant enough to become abstract. Not close enough to feel entirely separate from the world as it is now understood. It sits in that uncomfortable middle space where familiarity and horror overlap. And for the families of the victims, it remains something entirely different again. Not a case. Not a narrative. But a set of absences that cannot be replaced. Time does not dilute that reality. It only changes the way it is carried. Years have passed since the discovery at 25, Cromwell Street, and with those years has come a gradual layering of perspective. New generations have learned about the case through documentaries, books, and discussions in forensic and criminological study. Each retelling reconstructs the events in slightly different ways, emphasizing different aspects, drawing attention to different lessons. But beneath all of those interpretations, the core reality remains unchanged. A residential house in an ordinary street became the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern British history. Within its structure, over a span of years, multiple lives were taken, concealed, and only eventually brought back into the light through investigation that had to piece together what had been deliberately hidden. The physical absence of the house today does not diminish that fact. If anything, it reinforces the separation between what was visible and what was concealed beneath it. The space it once occupied has returned to ordinary use in a structural sense, but not in a symbolic one. Locations that carry histories of this nature rarely return fully to neutrality in the way surrounding streets do. There is always a trace, even if it is only psychological. One of the more difficult aspects of reflecting on this case is the tension between understanding and meaning. Understanding, in the investigative sense, has largely been achieved. The sequence of events, the evidence, the legal outcomes, the identification of victims, all of these elements have been established and recorded. But meaning is not as easily contained. Meaning continues to shift depending on context, depending on distance, depending on whether the focus is on individual lives or systemic failures, depending on whether the emphasis is placed on prevention, on recognition, or on remembrance. This is why cases like this remain part of ongoing discussion long after they are legally concluded. Not because there is uncertainty about what happened, but because there is continuous effort